Welcome to the podcast. We have the executive director of the Vancouver Aboriginal Policing Center in Vancouver, and Norm Leech, a good friend of ours. Really honored to have you join us and to talk about anti-racism initiatives that we're working on today, but how the historical impact of colonialism is affecting us to this very moment in 2021. And just before we started, we talked about what happened in London, Ontario, where a 20-year-old white supremacist ran over a visibly Muslim family in traditional clothing and killed them. And just before that, the revelation in Kamloops at a residential school, 215 children, Aboriginal children, that their bodies and remains were found under very, very horrific circumstances. So all of these leading into our discussion that the First Nations peoples before colonialism had, and I'll let you start with the First Nations traditions, beliefs, culture prior to colonialism, and the relationship with the environment, with the relationship with each other, and then we'll talk about what happened when the colonialists came. But let's talk about how things were before.
Okay, sure. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here. Yeah, we have grown to know and meet Tarek and Yosef over the past few months, and happy to participate in a conversation that really needs to spread so that people have a much better understanding of what's going on and not act out of misconceptions. And a large part of what we do at our office is dispelling those misconceptions that people have about Indigenous people and the history. And so maybe an example is, say, land acknowledgements, right? So when I do a land acknowledgement, and people have heard them, right? And they're all, people have them in their emails. But I start with the land. So I start with, like, say, this picture of this land behind me. This is where my ancestry lies. This is the Fraser River and the mountains. It's the canyon. The view from up above Lillooet, which is where my ancestry is. So we acknowledge the land first because the land was there first, before we were humans. And we consider the land to be our oldest ancestor, somewhat like our greatest grandmother. And so the ancestor we share, like with the dinosaurs even. And the land has always provided everything, right? Every cell of your body, every molecule, every atom came from the land originally. And for us who lived in that one place for thousands of years, we then know that every cell, molecule, atom came from this land and that of our ancestors, and will return there, well, if we're lucky. So when the people say they are the land, it's literally true. So we acknowledge the land first, and as an ancestor, as a grandmother, because the land has given everything without limit, without condition, without interruption, forever. Well, that's essentially a definition of love. When someone gives everything all the time without condition, that's love. So we know that the land loves us. And we know that we can never fully repay that love, but we do owe a duty to protect, manage, use, defend in a good way, and to improve as much as possible. So then I acknowledge the people who've taken care of the lands. And where I'm actually sitting right now, I'm not sitting up in the mountains here. I'm in so-called Vancouver. But for here, it's been the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh people who've lived here for a long time and have taken care of these lands for at least 10,000 years, essentially since the Ice Age ended. And we know that they took such good care of this land that it was actually better than new when the explorers arrived, because Indigenous people always understood it was their responsibility to leave the land as good as or better as it was provided to them. And so they did. That's why the salmon runs were so amazing. And the forests were so gigantic. The buffalo herds were so unbelievable to settlers or explorers when they arrived, because the people took such good care of the land, because she's our ancestor. So that's a different land acknowledgement, also with a little bit of a history lesson included. And that defines the relationship with the land that Indigenous people have. It's not property, it's a relative, which is totally different. You can't treat a relative the way modern colonized people treat the land in too many instances. So that forms the start of one of the differences between a colonized way of thinking and an indigenous way of thinking. Because also then, if you think of land as property, that you give yourself permission and the right to treat it like property, which is a problem over the long term. It's not sustainable. And then it also opens the door to turning, say, animals into property, and trees into property, and everything into property, including, well, then you start to say, well, that's my child. And then you say, well, that's my daughter, and that's my wife, and that's my slave. And we believe that that's one of the, unfortunately, premises of a colonized way of thinking. And we don't really understand it very well. It doesn't make sense to us to turn everything into property, because our understanding is everything's in relation. It's in relationship. It's not property. It's not to be owned. It's not to be mistreated. It's to be treated in relationship, which is a very different perspective and probably colonized people, explorers, when they arrived, didn't understand that either, because they didn't. Well, we imagine that they must have lost their connection to the land, and that feeling of being connected to land, and not only to land, but to each other and to everything. And that's more of an indigenous understanding of what it means to be human here. It is to be connected, to be part of, not to be separate, not to be isolated. Maybe because in that other worldview where you're separated and you've decided that I'm me and everything else is not. You're not me. You're separated from me. I'm just me in here, and everybody's just me in here alone. Well, in that universe, everybody's alone. And that doesn't make sense to us either. In our universe, we're all connected. We're all related. But not only just people and not only just living things, but everything. That mountain, right? That river, the sun. We're in relationship. We're all in the same universe. To deny that we're in relationship is to, I think, indulge that very harmful human trait of arrogance, right? That we're men, right? We're made in God's image. Nothing else, no one else. And that gets us into trouble. So over the course of 10 or 15,000 years, Indigenous people around the world, like even in other parts of the world, there were Indigenous peoples who came up out of the land, right, and lived in those places for thousands of years and had, I believe, the same relationship with land that we do. But as people move around and learn new habits and new ways of thinking, that kind of fell down to the wayside to other ideas. And I think that's part of the reason why we end up in these conflicts and troubles and different ways of thinking that I think for the short term we think are useful and effective and maybe allow us to increase production and increase profits and develop new technologies, but over the long term it creates division and inequity and inequality and injustice. So I think it's time for us to go back and re-examine those ancient wisdoms that were embodied in Indigenous traditions. And I believe that all peoples have those traditions, those ancient wisdoms in their cultures, including you and everyone else who might hear this too. If we all of us go back into our family histories far enough, we know that there was a place where our ancestors lived in a specific land for a long, long time. And they had that kind of relationship with that land too. So specifically for us here, we lived fantastically well for thousands of years, and we lived everywhere, right? If you look at a map of where the reserves in Canada are now, they're spread all across the far Arctic coastline to the highest mountains, the hottest deserts. We lived everywhere. We didn't all cluster along the U.S. border like Canadians do. And we still live everywhere. So we spread to occupy all of the Americas were occupied by Indigenous people. And we grew over that period of time. So over a period of 10 or 15,000 years, the population just goes up, right? Human population curves always follow that logarithmic scale. It's what humans do. We invade. We're the most invasive species in the universe, as far as I know. But there was never a census taken, right? So there's no agreement on how high the population got. But we do know that roughly about 1492 is when the population started to drop like a rock. And that was due to new diseases, new pathogens that were introduced to our populations that we had zero immunity to. And probably one of the early ones was probably a form of coronavirus, which we had no immunity to. And so it spread like an epidemic, like a pandemic. And it didn't need explorers to spread it, right? Once one person got it, they spread it to their family, and they spread it to the community, and they spread it to their neighboring communities, and it spread far faster than the explorers could travel. So in most cases, the diseases arrived hundreds of years before the explorers arrived and had their devastating impacts before an explorer ever showed up to see. So that's probably why when explorers arrived, it looked empty because they were a few hundred years behind and several plagues behind, because each disease, whether it was smallpox, chickenpox, measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, pertussis, the cold, the flu, all those things killed us. And so, right, so one might come through and it's like, oh my God, everyone's dying. And then maybe it might last a couple of years and then it stops finally, and you finally say, oh, that was horrible. Boy, we lost half the people. And then a few years later, another one would come. And the same thing would happen. And then maybe a few years later after that, another one would come, a different one. And then who knows, maybe the first one would come back again. So that was 400 years of death. And I would imagine terror of a cough, terror of a sneeze, a runny nose, a fever, a spot on your child's skin. And nothing that had worked for thousands of years worked. None of our medicines, none of our ceremonies, none of our ways of being. We couldn't see what it was. We couldn't hide. It just kept coming. for 400 years. And like I say, long before the explorers arrived. So you had no idea where it was coming from, and nothing worked. And then the explorers came, and then they started imposing laws, other laws, right? Laws not in our language, not according to ours. We had laws, but the land taught us. The land taught us what worked, and that's what we followed. The land taught us how to treat the salmon, how to take care of the medicine, how to take care of the food growing areas, how to live peacefully with our neighbors, right? How we, how many animals we could hunt, all those things the land taught us over thousands of years. And so each people knew exactly how best to live in those lands. It was different in Lillooet than it was on the prairies, and it was in the Arctic than it was on the coastal rainforest here. But then the explorers arrived and started imposing laws, pushing us onto reserves, pushing us off our traditional lands, and creating laws that prevented us from doing what we had done for thousands of years. And based on, a set of principles and values that was developed far away across the ocean in Europe. And they brought those here and imposed them here on these lands. Maybe they worked great there, but they weren't designed for here. And they weren't by us or for us. So we know that that system of laws, that so-called justice system, was never designed or intended to provide justice for us. We know that. We knew that from the start. But we also know that probably the low point of our population was about 1900. That's when records show that the U.S. had a census and counted their Indians, and so did Canada around 1900. And there was only about 250,000 Indians in the U.S., and there was about 100,000 in Canada. And roughly, if you estimate that our population could have been 35 million for all of North America, then that would have represented a survival rate of about 1% after 400 years of disease, death, dislocation, discrimination. And that's hard to imagine what it would have been like to be one of those 1%. After 400 years of despair, how do you not just take the hint? How do you not start to believe that, I think the Creator is telling us that, it's not meant to be for us. Right? These other people are here, they're coming in, they're pushing us off our lands, they're imposing these laws on us, they're taking our children away. And then I thought about them from another perspective, that could those survivors, those 1%, have been weak? Could they have been slow? Could they have been stupid? No, they would have had to have been tough and resilient and have courage and never quit. And in fact, they would have been the greatest human survivors on the planet at the time. No one on the planet would have survived as much death and disease and destruction as them. And thank them for not giving up and for hanging on and staying alive. Because without them, I wouldn't be here. No Indigenous people would be here. And then that also makes clear that every Indigenous person alive today in the Americas is descended from those survivors. And so we inherited that survivor spirit. And that sort of makes it a little bit more important what they did and what we owe them for doing that for us. and what we owe the land. It's our responsibility. That was a sacred responsibility. That was our almost, I don't want to say bargain, but it was in exchange for all the gifts that we received as humans, and all humans, the gift of our intellect, of our mobility, of our dexterity, of our judgment, of all the gifts that we have. We're supposed to take care of the land. That's our understanding. That's what it means to be a good human being, to fulfill that responsibility, not exercise rights to exploit and own and destroy the land. That wasn't wasn't part of the package, because it would actually harm us in the long run, and we knew that. So we can't talk about the history without talking about recent history and the understanding of, people have these misconceptions about Indigenous people. And of course, they're taken from the media. The news, probably the most picture that people see most often of Indigenous people in Vancouver is probably of the downtown east side. And they see people down there who have suffered and are suffering. And then people form this vision in their mind about, well, that's who they are, that's what they do. And it's unfortunate, but it's their choice. Right? And the statistics kind of bear that out, right? So if I do a presentation to anyone, I say, so who in this room has the shortest life expectancy, right? And the data shows it's me. Indigenous men have roughly 12 years shorter life expectancy than everyone else. Which group suffers the highest infant mortality rates in Canada? Well, that's us. Who probably has the lowest income levels in the country? That's us. Who has the lowest graduation rates from high school? Us. From university or college? Us. Who's most likely to be taken into care? Children in care? Us. More than 50% of children in care are Indigenous. Who's most likely to be arrested? Us. Most likely to go to jail? Longer jail sentence? Repeat jail sentences? Who's mostly die of suicide? Die by police? Us. Who's most likely to get HIV/AIDS, COVID-19, diabetes, almost every negative social health indicator that's measured, we lead. Okay, that's horrible. Probably means survival is tough. Who's the fastest growing population in the country? Us. How does that make sense? All those things are killing us off faster and more often than everybody else, and we're the only naturally growing population in the country. The only way that makes any sense to me is factoring in that survivor spirit that we inherited from our ancestors. We were selected for survival. So the more we understand that, and the more we work, like at the community policing center, most of our work occurs downtown east side. So we work with the people who are down there. And of course, they face the hardest challenges in the country: homelessness, overdose, poverty, violence, conflicts with police, conflicts with each other, racism, discrimination, disease. And many of them have died multiple times, right? Because of poison drugs, fentanyl, carfentanil. And then they keep going. And then they still want to help each other. Not so much themselves, but others. And they will give the shirt off their back and their last food to someone who needs it more. And we realize that just as much as we're survivors and descendants of survivors, so are they. And as much as I'm a survivor of those streets too, it's been many years since I was down there, but these people are still there. And we have no idea what they had to survive in their childhood or in their youth or in their adulthood or every day. And it's far more than most of us have to survive. And they keep going. And that's why we know that if we could help them heal, get back to who they're supposed to be, what are they capable of? These people are superheroes in survival capacity. No one has survived more than them. And the same can be said for survivors of war, survivors of famine, survivors of giant natural disaster. But it's just trying to find a different perspective on seeing what's possible and why we do the work. So it's, and of course, because we work and we understand that it's trauma, right? So these people are in this position, and Indigenous people across the country are in these positions because of intergenerational trauma, right? The trauma of colonization, the trauma of residential schools. And it seems it's pretty accepted now that trauma can be intergenerational. It can be passed down to your descendants. And it seems like it's unfair. Like I just got born and I already have trauma, the trauma of my ancestors. But if it's true that we inherit the trauma, then it's also true that we inherit every skill that enabled our ancestors to survive, right? So we must also inherit the survivor spirit. And so that's the key to understanding healing the trauma, is understanding that it wasn't just the trauma, it was everything else too. And if we can tap into that, then we believe the sky's the limit as far as tapping into the potential of Indigenous people rather than just the things that have happened to us. And so we have those tools now to help train frontline workers to work around, beside, and to help with trauma, and in a way that they don't take on too much of it themselves. And because for frontline workers, they know that when you work alongside or with or near trauma for a long time, it burns you out. So we've found ways of working with it to be more effective, to protect ourselves and to so most people don't understand that history, right? And I wasn't taught it at school. I did the research. I had to go and find the research of the history and also the current statistics. Those aren't a secret, but it's not presented in that way. And actually, usually I draw a graph, right? Because it makes it more, it makes the point, right? When you show the population basically dropping straight down for 400 years. And it bounced. After 1900, it bounced. Like it's been from 350,000, it's probably over 3 million in roughly 100 years. But colonization has impacted us more than just population-wise, right? And we need to understand the mechanisms of colonization if we're really going to heal from it, and to understand that it wasn't accidental, that it wasn't just a coincidence. We weren't the first colonized, right? Colonization wasn't invented in the Americas. Africa and Asia and the Middle East and parts of Europe, they colonized each other for thousands of years before they got here. So the mechanisms and the methods and the strategies of colonization were well developed and well understood by the time they got here. And many people around the world suffered just as much as us. It's just a little further back, right, in history. If you go back in your family history, you'll find the colonization there that your ancestors had to survive. You'll find those other intergenerational traumas that they had to survive too. Like everyone's family history includes war, famine, pandemic. But at the same time, you're descended from the survivors, right? Because we know that many did not survive, right? So we're the ones descended from the ones who did. Now, can we put those survival skills to the best impact, to the best actions, so that we can, provide a sustainable future for our descendants, our grandchildren and great grandchildren? I think that's the question in front of all of us today. Is there a better way? So, we've begun to ask those questions. Is this really? So when you consider colonization came here and they imposed those laws from far away, and like I say, maybe they worked fantastic back in England or France, and it worked there, but they imposed those same laws here without asking, will that work here? Without asking us, actually, what's the best way to live here in these lands? They didn't ask. They just assumed and then imposed these laws. And in many cases, we could have told them that, no, that won't work here because of this or another multiple reasons. An example is like Simon, like in this picture, Fraser River. The first explorer was Simon Fraser, right, in 1808, barely 200 years ago. So he came floating down the river with guides from somewhere else. And well, actually, we had a big argument because a lot of the people just wanted to kill him and take all his stuff. But cooler heads prevailed, and they said, okay, well, we'll trade and we'll let him keep going. But we did tell him there's a shorter route to the coast. If you turn right here and take this river and these lakes, you'll be at the coast in a few days, and you won't have to go through all the rapids of the Fraser. But he wouldn't believe us, and he didn't take our word for it, and he kept going down the Fraser River, and barely survived, and actually didn't make it to the ocean. But if he had taken our advice, he would have been there sooner and safer, because they just assumed that they knew better, that we were primitive, and we didn't have written language, and that we didn't know what we were talking about because we didn't speak English or worship the same God as them. But we believe that over time, it's been proven that the ancestors had depths of wisdom that science is still only catching up to. And that colonization is not the answer, and that it doesn't have all the answers, and it is not best in all situations. And really all we want to do is have the conversation. Okay, then if we were going to do what's best, what works, then how would that be? And I make also the case that as hard as colonization has been to Indigenous people, it's been actually far worse on women, especially our women, but all women around the world. And that became clear to me when, of course, the Me Too movement began, getting profile and getting tweets and shares, and realizing that, it wasn't just Indigenous women who are being missing and murdered. and that actually women in, beautiful, powerful, rich women in Hollywood are not safe. That they're being abused and mistreated and exploited. And then realizing that, well, it's not just there either. It's everywhere. It's in India, it's in the United States, is there a place on this planet where it's safe for women? I don't see it. And I think, well, how has humanity come to this? And also realizing that our communities, it was safe to be women because women had authority, women had power, women were respected because they had amazing gifts that men didn't have. Right? They had amazing strengths in other areas, and we knew that, and it was respected so that the communities could benefit from those gifts of women. To understand, they knew the medicines, they knew how to plan long term. They had way more patience, all those things. Where men we have weaknesses. And so understanding that, unfortunately, and it's easy for us here now to lay everything at the feet of colonization, right? Because to us, they're all connected. For other people, maybe they've separated them, that misogyny is separate from capitalism, which is separate from inequality, which is separate from racism, which is separate from all the other injustices that are, but for us, they're all related to colonization because they all came at the same time with colonization. So we think that they're all intricately intertwined, including misogyny and racism. And it's so pervasive. And most people have no idea how colonized they've become and how much of an impact it's had on their traditions and their ways of life. And the definitions of what it is to be human being, or what is justice. So I hope it's possible for humanity to have the discussion about what is fair, what is a better way to treat women, right? We often have these conversations: how do we make, Vancouver safer for women? And the conversation always centers around, well, how do we respond better? How do we, investigate assaults better? How do we prosecute the crimes better? How do we help them heal better? And very rarely is the conversation about, what? Why can't men just stop hurting women? Because the greatest threat to women's safety is men. And that wasn't the way our communities were. It was safe for women in our communities. So what is it about colonization that leads to that? And we think it's because of that separation, that isolation of me from you and from everything else. And the idea that I'm an individual and I'm over here and everything else is just property. If we were all interconnected and we understood that and we both agreed on that, then it wouldn't make sense for me to try to benefit at your expense, because it doesn't work that way. It works better if we both benefit. And you leave children alone and you say, here's a bunch of food, figure out what to do with it. For the most cases, it isn't just the biggest and the strongest take it all. It's that they all agree that let's all eat. And that way we'll all be healthier and we'll all do better. And that's the way. But boy, so many of these ideas of colonization have become so entrenched that they're not questioned any longer. And all we want to do is start saying, well, is that true? And says who? Because what we found is the greatest way to entrench those ideas is to write them down into laws. And then it's hard to change them. And then they get stuck there. And maybe they were good for then, but they're not adapting, they're not evolving, which I think is one of the great beauties and elegance and power of the oral tradition. We didn't have written language, which forced us to have these conversations about everything, right? So if we had a disagreement about something, I couldn't go to the law book and say, sorry, Tarek, it says here that this is my land. And then there's no argument. There's no conversation. There's no discussion. Unless, of course, you have another law that says the opposite. Well, then we have to argue over which one's valid. But so in our system, we had to have the conversation. We had to come to an agreement, an understanding on what I understood to be the truth and what you understood to be the truth. And we would have to, and maybe it would come down to a fight, and maybe there would be hard feelings, but then we would still have to resolve it. But it would always be done in relationship. Right? I can never pretend that we're not in relationship, because that's not the truth. At some point, you'll show up, or your children will show up. And it's not just us either. It's the relationship with the land and with everyone else and everything around us. And we always have to behave accordingly in order to preserve the balance of all those relationships. So I don't know, is any of that making sense?
Oh, it is. It's all interconnected and intertwined. And I think just even to talk about the history, as you've been talking about, the history that we were taught growing up here in Canada in school, which you may have come across this textbook, Our Land Building the West. It's a very arrogant title, Our Land Building the West. And it didn't talk about this. It didn't talk about this holistic relationship with land. And what is civilized, what is civilization, is respecting the environment. And what you brought up about, and I've been thinking about it since we met the first time, when you said the trees are our ancestors, the mountains are our ancestors, the land is our ancestors. And I think when we think we're separate from, and we have to take and own and these sorts of things, it's a very arrogant belief system. And as you said, values and beliefs from other countries trying to implement their views here is the height of arrogance. So my question about when the colonialists came and First Nations people, that this was what you taught me was religion, identity, race was all one. There was no, I am this race and this religion and this culture and this beliefs. It was all entwined. Let's talk about that. And then that clash of ideologies when the colonialist, the individualist, the trying to own and hurt and kill in the way that colonialists did, but the identity of First Nations and beliefs and traditions and cultures, how it's one rather than individual identities.
Well, like we spoke many languages in BC, right? There's probably 25 at least separate, distinct languages in BC, which makes BC really about as diverse as Europe, right? So we had different cultures, we have different languages and different ways of understanding, but most people in pre-contact probably spoke 7 or 8 languages in order to talk to and trade with all the neighbors, because we always also understood that you couldn't really marry within your community, right? That was bad practice. It was, so it was like an understanding that the Creator put us there, but it came with responsibilities more than rights. We don't have a word for rights. We understood that, you know, we had to take care of things and leave it as good as it was presented or better. So I was taught that the elders, if you listen to the elders all day as they're, you know, picking berries or roots or catching fish or hunting or whatever it is they're doing, they're always saying, thank you, and giving thanks for everything all day, because this is an amazing gift, right? To be born human, because we have access to all this, right? Tastes and sensations, weather, everything. And in exchange, all we have to do is take care of the place. So it's not religion. It's more of a spiritual understanding of the universe, which I think all religions started as basically an attempt to define some basic ground rules as what it means to be a good human being, how we're going to live here together in a good way, and avoid conflict, and you know, maintain the peace and the balance. Unfortunately, once you start establishing those ground rules, and other people start saying, well, I don't like the way that works, but if I can set the rules, then I can have it be a little more in my favor. And unfortunately, probably the group of people who saw that first and were first able to take advantage of that, unfortunately, was old men. And it looks apparent to me that it doesn't take long for old men to seize power and control over the governance structure of, say, religion, say governance, say decision making, to their own advantage. And that means you know, subjugating women as property, children as property, land as property, and elevating men up above everything else. And that's a problem, because that's out of balance. And so those systems then came over intact from everywhere else, and they arrived here as one of the most effective ways of controlling people, having their an entirely separate, powerful sets of laws that came with it. Rules about what women could and couldn't do, about what marriage included, that children were property. All those rules came from religious laws first, and then they were reflected in, you know, in the government laws later. And we know that, well, the standard understanding is that you're supposed to separate church from state, right? And that's common wisdom, I guess, that they would say, that's, you know, you shouldn't impose religion on people. But when we developed constitution for our community, we found that we could not, because our spiritual beliefs are the basis for our ethics, right? For what is right and wrong. And it's the underpinning of justice, right? What is fair? And what does it mean to be a good human being? And so if we cut those out of government and decision making, then we sort of cut them free from having any responsibility, any moral responsibility or foundations for their decision making. And then it simply becomes a corporate structure. So we couldn't. And then in understanding that, we discovered that really it's a lie. When a country like the United States says, well, we've separated church from state, but if you look at them, it's obvious they haven't. It is based on a religious foundation. And it's easy to see which religion it's based on. And any constitution and nation is probably based on some moral, ethical foundation that is based on a specific religious tradition. But at their roots, they're all basically similar. They basically all say, yes, we're supposed to be good human beings. We're supposed to take care of each other, and treat each other in a respectful way, and it should all be based on love. At their roots, every religion says that. It's just that over time they all kind of, got a little bit corrupted here and there, and hijacked it in their governance models. So it's been a hugely effective tool of colonization, religion. And maybe as an illustration of the difference, so I've been taught our cultural and somewhat spiritual traditions of, say, sweat lodge or fasting, and how to be a good human being. And probably the best illustration is I was taught, so sweat lodge keeper saying, this is how we do it here. Other people do it differently. Some people don't sweat at night. Others will sweat at night. Others don't allow women. Some do allow women. As long as you do it in a good way, it's good. And there's a million good ways of doing everything. So if you do it in a good way, it's good. Whereas religion is, no, there's only one right way, and everything else is wrong. And if you do it those other ways, geez, you might go to hell. So to me, that's an illustration of the difference. And it's not about power and control for us. It's about understanding what it means to be a good human being and establishing your own personal relationship with Creator, with land, with each other, with the universe, and how to learn yourself what it means to be a good human being. And that worked for us for thousands of years. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And then when when the colonialists came and the systems of taking land, dividing land, and then pushing First Nations to living situations which were against the way of life and traditions of First Nations people. So obviously the systemic nature of the systemic genocide of First Nations people over the last number of centuries, systemically and by design, by the colonialists, to take the land, to take the resources, to take the benefits, and relegate First Nations to reservations, which was never the way of life, which was never the tradition or the religion of First Nations people, because the religion, the faith, the traditions was expansive, encompassing, renewable, sustainable, which was the opposite of the colonialists. So the clash from there is being felt to this day. So now where we are in 2021, and we are in a climate crisis because of these philosophies of colonialists, overfishing to the point of extinction. You mentioned the buffalo earlier. Many species, land species, are on the verge of extinction because of commerce, because of greed, and because of value systems that put profits over human beings and profits over our environment and our land and our resources. So that being said, perhaps the First Nations civilization is more civilized, like the civilization that we've been taught to be was civilization. The First Nations for thousands of years proved what civilization is in sustainability, renewability. So as we are approaching crises as humanity, and possible solutions and possible ways forward, because at the moment with global warming, with all these different problems, What are possible ways forward that we can all work together and learn from our First Nations ancestors and leaders to see what we can do? Please.
Sorry, I was already unmuted. So I would encourage everyone to dig into your own Indigenous roots, right? People come into the office here and they say, "Oh, am I allowed to get help here? Because I don't know if I'm Indigenous." And I say, "Well, first, I don't check ID. I can't do a blood test. And frankly, I think everyone is actually Indigenous to somewhere, right? So dig into that and explore your ancestry, where your ancestors did live in a place for 1,000 years. And then you can sense into that connection to land that must have existed back then too. And understand the value systems that they must have had in place in order to do that for such a long time. And what life must have been like. So and largely these are, you're talking the effects of economic systems. And so for us, being so interconnected and also knowing that we all had responsibilities to take care of everyone in community, but also everybody had responsibilities to actually give back to community, right? So knowing that we all had gifts and that it was our responsibility to use those gifts in the most effective way to help the people. We also understood that hoarding, gathering wealth didn't make sense. Sure, you wanted to gather enough to survive winter, but not just for you. It wasn't a benefit that if that your family was the only one that would survive the winter. It was, you needed everybody to survive, right? And someone's gift would pay off eventually when you needed it. So there was only one acceptable reason in our communities to collect and gather and hoard possessions. And that was so that as soon as you got them all together, maybe your family spent 2 years collecting things together, then you would have a great gathering and a feast and you would give it all away. And that's, that was, for certain purposes, for a celebration, for an event, maybe a wedding or ascension to a chieftains or to commemorate something amazing. But then you were left with nothing except the honor of having done that. And then I guess in a way it's like everybody owed you, but you got it back, right? Because it still doesn't make sense to us why it is that someone needs $1 billion, I don't get it. And I don't know if it makes sense to a lot of people, except for those people who have $1 billion, and to them, for whatever reason, it makes them feel good, I guess. It doesn't make them healthier, or maybe it does. And I don't know if it makes them better human beings or not. But some would say, well, yeah, I'm not going to go there. So again, I'd ask the people to question those assumptions, those unquestioned assumptions that this modern society is based on, right? Some would say that, well, you can't really consider any other form of government other than democracy because all the others are not as good. Well, says who? We didn't have democracy for thousands of years, right? We didn't have one vote, one person system. And in fact, most of what calls itself democracy isn't really democracy anyways, right? It's representative government, but it's not true democracy. And it's open and it's subject to manipulation and abuses. So at some point, I think everyday people are going to have to start asking themselves the question. And sometimes I speak to groups of 100 or 200 people on Zoom and say, if it was, and that's a big circle. I say to them, if it was up to us here today to have a discussion on what would be, if it was up to us to write the rules on how we would live together here in so-called Vancouver, what kind of rules would we come up with? And would they be the same as the ones that are imposed on us now? Because largely, none of us were involved in writing those rules, those laws, those regulations that we're, that we're bound to follow, or that are, going to be enforced on us. And Indigenous people know that since we didn't write those rules, that they're not written to our benefit. And to us, it's clear that they benefit most the people who wrote them. And that's not us. And it's not you either. And it's usually not women. So we think that if people are willing and open to participate and have the conversation, who knows what amazing answers we could come up with. Just because this is the way it's been for, 100, 200, even 1,000 years, doesn't mean it's the best way. And it doesn't mean we can't come up with something better. And we have 10, 15,000 years of wisdom about what it means to live here and what works here. We are completely willing to share, teach people what it means to be a good human being here. And we think that should be respected everywhere, right? People in Pakistan know best how it is to be good human beings there in Pakistan, or in India, or in Russia, or in China, or everywhere. But boy, that's a big ask, and that's a big conversation.
It is, and even the wisdom and the oral tradition of sharing the history from generation to generation, and language. And we talked about language in our previous discussions, language and culture, and why that matters, and that we own our heritage, we own our culture, we own our language, our original languages. Let's talk about that and that place in our lives, and how that informs our respect for our traditions and cultures, and our First Nations traditions, cultures, and languages.
Well, like I say, we didn't have a word for rights. So it's clear to us that the Creator didn't give us the right to do these things, but we have words for responsibilities. So those things become clear, as that the things you have words for are important, and the things that you don't have words for don't need to be discussed. And so even if you just examine the English language, which we're using, and that's the only one I've got, boy, it's about control, it's about ownership, it's about hierarchy, it's about order. It's linear, it's got to be in the right order. It's pretty technical, and it's not a very spiritual language. It takes a Shakespeare, and there's very few of them, to actually make that English language, get to your heart, right? Or your spirit. So, and our languages were about relationship, and they weren't about linearity of time, and it wasn't about mine or his, hers, possessives. It was, and those nuances of worldview are reflected in those languages. And so there's meanings that are easily conveyed in our language that are very, very difficult to convey in English. And unfortunately, I'm not a fluent speaker. Like, I know a little bit of our language, but I know enough to know those things. And I've been taught by some people who are fluent, and they're learning to, and they're teachers. But I can't give you examples and demonstrate all of those personally. And it's a tough language sometimes. It's got some different sounds. But it's better for reflecting our worldview. than the other.
You brought up love earlier in the conversation, and love in English has a certain meaning, and in other languages like Arabic and other languages, there's so many words for love and the depth of love and the types of love, and love is just one word. Whereas I'm sure in First Nations languages and languages around the world, these words have more nuanced meaning than English allows us for. And so, as you said, our linear culture, there's more to it. And let's talk about the non-linearity of just traditions and really understanding energy. And in the culture, we talk about sweat lodges and customs and traditions that are very different from the North American understanding of time, the North American understanding of energy and beliefs.
Well, science can't explain all of it either, right? Quantum physics is sort of questioning all the fundamentals of the speed of light, right? Of existence, right? Of the observer affecting the event. Our what cosmic understanding is different. It's based on transformation. All our stories are about transformers and transforming, and so we understood that it wasn't creation and destruction. It was transformation. And science has only pretty recently discovered that matter is energy transformed, and it transforms back and forth from matter to energy, and space and time transform back and forth into each other. And so they're not separate and they're not immutable. And actually, there is no more creation and destruction in the universe. And so, in a sense, we could say that the Big Bang wasn't actually creation, it was transformation. It was the instant when the Great Spirit transformed into the universe. And therefore, we're all part of it. And the universe is the Great Spirit experiencing existence, and we're part of it, right? And so to be born human means to allow the universe to have these experiences through us. And that's amazing. Again, it's the greatest gift in the universe that I can imagine. But we only get this little bit of time to participate, right? And to try and make that as meaningful and useful and valuable to the universe through us. So also knowing that to exist is to have spirit, is to be part of Great Spirit. And also to know that spirit is separate, it's different from the physical, right? The physical physics is about the measurable, right? And that has its own rules. But quantum physics doesn't have to follow those same rules. And I don't think spirit has to follow those same rules. I don't believe that spirit is bound by the physical laws of the universe. And so we have, probably most people have had experiences where they feel that they've been or seen somewhere else. Or maybe they've seen something from the past, or maybe they've seen something from the future. And physically, that's not possible. But spiritually, who knows? We don't know. We have faith that it exists, that the physical existence is just one small part of the overall spiritual universe. So your spirit is not bound by your body. It's attached, it's connected. It's your way to experience physical sensation, taste, all those things. But you have a spirit, which is more than, it's beyond, and it's part of everything else too. So there's no spiritual law that says you can't remember the future or somewhere far away. And most people have, even within their own families, stories of someone waking up in the night and saying, oh my God, something happened, right? And there being no physical way of knowing that, and yet it being true. And very often it's mothers and children, siblings, partners, and that's to us, that's spiritual connection. And we have those senses. We believe, we know we have those senses, but colonization would teach you that you only have 5. That's it, right? Sight, hear, smell, taste, touch. That's it. Really? I disagree. I call bullshit, right? Because I have a sense of time. I have a sense of direction. I have a sense of justice. And I have a sense of connection with the land, with the people, with the mountain, with the river, with the universe. And the more I sense into it, the better I get at it, because I'm exercising it. And so the more you exercise it, the more you can. But if you're taught you don't have it, then why would you? So part of the things and tools that we teach to help people work with trauma is to find that interconnected sense and explore all your other senses, because they're there. And that's a big part of being human too. Not just accepting someone saying, no, that doesn't exist, and doing your own exploration. And we help with that, to a certain extent. We don't want to get into, we try to teach practical tools on how to help people be with, recognize, and work with and heal trauma, right? Because that will help them right here, right now, in their physical human existence. But more than that, there's their spiritual health. And that will have greater, longer term impacts on everything. It's easier to be happy if if you have an understanding of what it means to be a good spiritual being.
And even these emotional feelings of self-esteem, self-respect, worthiness, joy, and happiness, and other people trying to impose their values, their sense of worth or value, and to decolonize our minds of what is valuable, and that we are one, we're complete, we're whole, we're valuable as individuals, and to not believe in the colonialist delusion that tries to say otherwise for any of us.
Yeah, your values, the work that you do and the output that you produce each day. It's like, really? Ouch. That's a pretty desolate view of what it means to be human, this amazing gift of being human. And really our job is to help someone else make profits? Are you serious?
And the value each and every one of us has, regardless of what's in the bank account, is the wonder of each of us as human beings, and the value of each of us, each signature that we have that's different from any other human being, and to celebrate that difference and that uniqueness, and really, like you said, the nonlinear aspect of faith and tradition, and then trying to force people to believe in systems and values and enforce them, and then if people don't want to follow them, harm them and kill them and marginalize them. And I think this is where, to this stage in 2021, we're still seeing the after effects of colonialism in our minds, in our emotional states, in our well-being, in our economic states as people of marginalized communities, but only if we let it, and only if we accept it. And because we are valuable, and our traditions and our ancestors are still with us, and our future ancestors are with us, and that value is there. And this is just a thread along the chain to use a few metaphors. And so now we talk about our spirituality, and then there's the tangible world, the spiritual world. And as we said, we talked about how the oceans are our ancestors, our mountains are our ancestors, our trees are our ancestors, and they really need our help at this stage with the deforestation, the species going extinct. And who knows, we may go extinct because, as the coronavirus, we are kind of like a virus on this world, the way it's going right now. And we need to have an antibody, and we need to turn this virus around in a positive way. So, Norm, maybe on that note, let's. I know it's a big thing, but please offer your insights as to where we can go.
Ooh, yeah. Well, the Earth was here long before us, right? We have an opportunity to preserve our gift and to treat it with the respect that it deserves. But we also know that if we blow this chance, the Earth will be fine. The Earth, doesn't need us. I think it loves us, and it wants us to succeed. It wants us to learn these lessons so that we can, but it can't force us, right? But the more and more people I talk to about subjects like this, the more people want to continue the conversation. They want to consider it, and it's asking a lot of people. I mean, it's not, I'm not just asking them to think about it, because really what I bring them to is questioning foundation, bedrock principles that their careers, their lives, their sense of justice is built on those things. And I'm saying they're not everything. And you have to be willing to have a look at it, to question it, and to say, is it true? Is that really what justice is? Because like this, and I refuse to call it a justice system. I've said, because it wasn't designed or intended to provide justice to Indigenous people. It's based on a system of laws, on this other definition of justice, about, the basics of the Canadian justice system is probably in the Bible, really, the Ten Commandments, the Judeo-Christian model of right and wrong, which is really also based on the Old Testament version of, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then, and it's based on the concepts of sin and penitence, which translate to crime and punishment. And the entire criminal legal system of Canada and many other Western countries is based on the same concepts. And ours never was. Ours was based on balance and harmony and healing. And how do we get those? Because those harmful acts where someone harms another and causes trauma on another person, that's evidence of imbalance. And so the goal is to restore the balance and to heal the harm, which is nature's way, right? You suffer trauma, your arm breaks, that's trauma. And then you set it, and then you stop doing what made it happen, and then you let it heal, and you learn from it. So applying those types of principles to our relationship with everything else, with the land, with each other, with the solar system, ultimately, in the universe, is what is our role in restoring the balance and maintaining the harmony and facilitating the healing. And those are reflected in some more modern ideas like restorative justice or transformative justice, which focuses more on those aspects than the doling out of guilt and punishment. Because really, all the evidence and research proves that it really doesn't work. What it does is it makes better criminals, and it fills prisons. And maybe it provides someone some profit somewhere, but it doesn't really make society a better place, and it doesn't make better human beings. But so talking about decolonization actually causes people to question everything, right? Because everything is colonized in the society. So whether it's the education system, whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's our models of governance, whether it's our so-called justice systems, or our economic systems, they're all colonized and they're all intertwined. And from our perspective, they all cause harm. So can we start to say, okay, well, understanding that, then it's not an easy path to something new, but I don't think we're going to get anywhere unless we start having the conversations. And part of that is about learning how to have difficult conversations, right? To find the ways of not relying on the rule of law and then say, you know what, we're going to put that aside and we're going to talk about what's right, what's fair, and what preserves the relationship instead of winners and losers, because that presumes that that relationship's going to end. That there's a winner who wins and the loser goes away, and it's based on the illusion that you're not in relationship, which is an illusion. You're both still on the planet. You're both talking with your communities, and you're both feeling the effects, whether it's the benefits or the detriments of what happened. And it affects the world around you. So to pretend that you're not in a relationship is a lie. So to respect the fact that we are all in relationship, and we still must behave accordingly, and that it's in all our best interest that we learn how to have those conversations and maybe disagree, maybe completely on that subject, right? But we probably do agree on 95% of the other stuff. What does it mean to be a good human being, right? Take care of each other, treat each other with respect, and act from love, not fear, not hurt, not anger, not shame, but find the love.
And that is the challenge, is finding the love in spite of all the negativity and all the reasons not to feel love. And that is, I would say, the greatest challenge is to find the love when we witness all these things.
It sounds like it, but so so I didn't talk like this 3 years ago. I didn't talk about this stuff. I kind of thought about it, but it was learning the trauma training, and it's a specific form of trauma therapy. And then there's a process of kind of like a guided meditation, where basically you go in and sometimes you say, today, if you were a tree, or if you were a rock, or if you were a mountain, and allowing your body and letting the mind shut up and get out of the way, and just let yourself experience what that would be like. And it's in those experiences over time and over many experiences where I learn to accept what my relationship with land has been, and all through my ancestors, and to come to that understanding that the land, man, has it given everything to us. And that is, there's so much love for the land there, or the land has for us. And to let that in and to have that, my body experience that feeling, and it's more than a feeling, is overwhelming. And it's fabulous to feel that and to know that, and that puts the love of other people kind of meaningless. And if all people understood and let that in and let themselves feel the love that the land has for them, then we wouldn't care whether someone, this other person, or someone, they loved us, because we've got more than we can handle with allowing the land to love us. And it's just so much easier to be happier. And then it's also the understanding when you're interconnected with everything and you know that, then the other benefit is you always know that you're never alone. Never, ever, ever alone. I could be alone on top of that mountain, be the only one on that mountain, and maybe see no one else. I'm not alone, because that mountain's there with me. The land is there with me. This clouds, the sky, the spirits of all my ancestors are there with me all the time. And if you have that sense of developed, you know that. And it's so helpful. And it makes everything else so much easier.
Agreed. And to let that love in, and to even turn that love on ourselves, that to love ourselves.
Man, it keeps us healthier, it keeps us happier, it keeps us stronger. And as someone who knows, like I grew up in East Vancouver, and I spent time down Skid Road, Vancouver. So I've done and used a lot of different drugs. But that feeling of letting that love in, that's better than any drug I ever paid for.
And that was trying to connect again. Like, why we're trying all these things is because ultimately we want to love ourselves and feel that love and receive love.
To be loved, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is the note, because what you're doing with love for yourself and accepting the love from the land, and accepting the love from the ancestors, and accepting love from our creator as a starting point, and then we can love others.
Way better, yeah. Because we're not so worried. Like, so much of the harm or the trauma that's caused on the planet is because people are acting out of fear. Fear of losing something, fear of being hurt, fear of not being loved, fear of, and then it gets flipped into anger, right? Because and it's solvable. So
Well,
yeah,
I,
don't.
that was a powerful, therapeutic, spiritually uplifting conversation that changed my views and changed my point of view and paradigms. And these are the conversations we live for, because this is what we need to feed our souls and feed our psyche. And I really want to appreciate you and sharing your wisdom with us, because it's very much needed. And we're going to circulate this on all the various social media that we promote our programs through, and looking forward to our future work. We should do a plug for our event that we're doing together, the National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st, and really to talk about many of these things, but specifically relations to what's happened recently in Kamloops and other current events. So that's June 21st, and that'll be also on YouTube simulcast, Facebook Live, and other mediums. And thank you, Norm. Really appreciate it.
So let me also then share that, because of what we've learned and what I've learned, that a set of training has been developed. And so we've been able to get some funding, and we can deliver that training, and we have been on Zoom to frontline workers in Vancouver and other areas as well, to teach them how to have this new relationship, a different relationship with trauma. And if you have that, then you have the basis for a different relationship with everything, with land, with each other, with trauma itself. And then you'll be much better equipped to handle your own, to recognize it, and to avoid the harms that come with it, and also to help other people process their own too. So we use them every day, and it's helped us, help the community. And so we've shared these as much as we can, and we found people, who use them find great value in them, not only for themselves, but for the people they work with.
And where can we'd like to join. When is the next workshops being conducted?
I got one coming up in July and then another in August. And we're always looking for additional funding, because if someone will fund it for us, then we can provide it and not have to charge the participants fees. Otherwise, we would have to probably charge people like $1,000 to get through the training. So I could add you and Joseph to the list, wait list, email list that I send out, saying that I've got some seats, and it's kind of first come, first serve.
Fantastic. Well, Norm, what a great conversation. Yusuf, thank you for kind of putting all the pieces together for this conversation. So I think
thank you, Todd, for hosting it. So it was really informative.